So let me tell you about some of the work that I'm doing at the intersection between deep learning and cosmology, and essentially trying to bring those two concepts together for the analysis of modern cosmological surveys. So to give you a little bit of context for all of this work, let me start with this picture of the universe here, which kind of represents our current understanding of the physical modeling of the universe, which starts at some early time, and then it expands. You have galaxies that appear. And then what is very curious and what is very troubling to cosmologists these days is that at very late time, the universe seems to be accelerating its expansion. And it's something that we don't really understand, and that we need some amount of dark energy to explain this. So there is a new generation of surveys that are just coming online in the coming years that are especially designed to try to probe the universe at late time and try to understand the nature of this dark energy. And do this by essentially mapping the large-scale structure of the universe by looking at each of those galaxies that you see here. So here in Europe, we have the Euclid space mission that it will launch in the coming years. And in the US, the Rubin Observatory is already under construction. And so this is, for instance, this Rubin Observatory that I told you about, that is almost ready to start its survey. And you can think of this instrument as just a giant robot telescope. It's going to systematically observe the full sky at a rate of once every 3 nights. And what you see here is an animation of the telescope taking a little picture of the sky once every 30 seconds or so. So it's a huge amount of data. It's going to take about 1,000 images per night for a period of 10 years. So that's about 15 terabytes of data every night. And it's much more data than anything that we had to deal with in astrophysics at this point. It's also a huge chunk of the sky that will be observed. It's about half of the sky, everything that you can see from where the telescope is built. And that represents a huge increase in survey size compared to what existed before. There's also a nice aspect of this LSST because it's going to take many pictures of the sky. It will actually be able to make a movie of the changing sky as a function of time, which opens up a lot of new science use cases. But it's not just a huge amount of data, it's also a very high quality data. And so just to illustrate this, this is, for instance, an example of a galaxy as you could see it in a previous generation instrument. And in this previous generation of the SDSS here, the sky was pretty simple. Everything was just a blob. There's not a lot of details, and things are fairly well separated from each other. And then as we move to more recent surveys like the DES, which is still, it's a current survey, you can already see that each galaxies over here start to have more details, and you start to see a lot more of these objects on the sky. And if you move towards the data quality of next generation surveys like the Rubin Observatory will be able to do, you see that now the skies become very complicated. The galaxies have details, have complex morphologies, and they all start to overlap all over the place on the sky. So if we want to make very precise measurement of the properties of each of these little galaxies, it becomes very difficult to analyze these images. So this is just a metaphor of how complex the data analysis becomes at all of the stages of the analysis pipeline, and it starts at the level of these images here. So one question that we may want to ask is, well, if the data becomes so complicated, is this a task that AI can help us with and solve essentially all of our problems? So obviously, AI is not going to answer all of the problems, but it's still a very powerful tool with its limitations. And one of the things that I want to show you here is an example of those limitations. So I'm going to go back to this picture of the sky where you see this nice big galaxy here and the background galaxies over there. So one of the things that we need to do to analyze these images is separate out the light from each individual object. It's a task that we call deblending. And so this is something that you can try to use a machine learning approach to solve. So here is the paper from a couple of years ago now, who looks at one example of blended images. So 2 galaxies that overlap on the sky, and you feed it through a neural network, and that neural networks try to give you the independent contribution to this blended image. So you can do this, and it kind of works, but it also has a few issues that I would like to highlight, this kind of approach of using deep learning as a black box. So the first one is that once you've trained your network on some training images, then you no longer have explicit control about a lot of aspects of your data that are still pretty straightforward. So for instance, you no longer have explicit control about the level of noise that you have on your image or the amount of blurring that you might have because of the instrument. And so if, for instance, your data quality changes for any reason, if you have more noise in your images than what you've trained your network on, then the network doesn't apply anymore, and it can potentially give you the wrong answers. So that's not ideal. The second point is that you also have no strong guarantees on the network outputs. So for instance, although you may train it to do things like preserve the flux of the solution compared to what you had an input, it's not guaranteed to do so. And flux preservation is very important if we want to measure, for instance, the brightness of those galaxies. And finally, there is also no robust uncertainty quantifications typically with this kind of approach. So you get an answer, this one here on the right, but you don't know if it's the best answer, if there are multiple possible answers, or if there is any uncertainty on the answers. And if we want to do science with the solution that your network returns, uncertainty quantification is extremely important.
And just to illustrate on this particular example that I'm not making these issues up, they actually happen in practice if you're not careful. Here is an example of one of those artificial blends that you can generate for this network to deblend on its own. And you see here on the right that for no particular reason, the network has decided here to add an object in the image. So you see that this yellow stuff here is not in the input image. There is no reason for the network to put it here. There's actually no reason for the network to try to do this from the training set, but it's one of the failure mode that can happen because there is no, strong guarantees that it cannot add signal when there is no input signal. So that's an example of failure mode that we really do not want to see. All right, so what can we do about this? So that brings me to the focus of my talk. And the thing that we're going to try to do here during this talk is to merge the three concepts of bringing together deep learning models, uncertainty quantification in the form of Bayesian inference, and then physics, cosmology in the form of using actual physical models when we want to analyze some data or do some tasks. And so the thing that I will show you is that you can actually combine all of these concepts together to solve a task like this deep learning task or any of the tasks that we care about when we try to do physics with the signals. And it will essentially rely on the combination of these three SIMs, which you will see will come up every time in order the application that we'll show you. And so the first thing that I want to tell you about before I can show you actual applications is this concept of generative modeling, deep generative models. So maybe this is something that you've heard about even in the press these days, but I want to give you a short recap on what this means. Okay, so what is generative modeling? So essentially the goal of generative modeling is to try to learn what I will call an implicit distribution. An implicit distribution is a distribution P, it can be any sorts of distribution really, for which you do not have an analytic description, an analytic formula. But what you do have access to are samples from that distribution. So from these samples, the goal here is to build a parametric model for your distribution that you will try to fit to this unknown true distribution P just by having access to the samples. And then when I've done this fitting, then this model distribution will typically have an analytic description, analytic form that I can then use downstream in the problems that I care about. Okay, so it's a little bit abstract. So let's see in practice what this would look like. So I'm taking a true distribution P. So that's the simplest distribution you could think of, just a Gaussian. And then I'm saying that I have access to samples from the Gaussian. So if I don't know this underlying distribution and all I have access to are these samples, those points here, then I'm really in the case of this implicit distribution business. And then the goal of generative modeling in general is going to try to build a parametric model, P theta, that just based on this sample tries to estimate the underlying distribution that those samples were sampled from, okay? And the nice thing that happens when you are able to do something like this is that then you end up with this model distribution that gives you an actual way to compute the probability of a new data point, let's say, under the distribution that you've learned. And we'll see how interesting that is. So why did we need to wait until 2020, 2022 for talking about these deep generative models? Well, the reason is trying to estimate densities is something that people have done for a long time now, but they were faced with this notion of this problem called the curse of dimensionality, which means that as you go towards higher and higher, numbers of dimensions, it becomes harder and harder to learn some distribution. And so an easy visualization of this is, let's say that you have a fixed number of data points, that you try to learn a distribution from. If it's in 1D, you can see that the data points will be fairly densely populated, for instance, in this segment here. But if you go to 2D with the same number of data points, you see that everything is a lot sparser and you end up with like empty regions. And the same. So the higher the dimensions and the more empty your space becomes. And so the more difficult it becomes to learn a distribution with a fixed number of samples. And so that's why classical methods like kernel density estimation methods typically fail when you went above like 10 dimensions. So we're not applicable to practical problems in practice. And so that's where deep learning kind of changed the game with the evolution of, or the emergence of deep generative models. So to give you an idea of how much these models have improved over time, this is what the kind of like the state of the art was in 2006. These digits that you see here on the left are drawn from one of the deep generative models that have been trained on existing examples of digits. And then with time, we saw a huge phase transition in 2014 with the emergence of large node encoders and generative adversarial networks, which for the first time were able to learn with high precision accuracy the distribution of, let's say, natural images, so in very high number of dimensions. So here, these images might be 64 by 64. That's already hundreds of dimensions. To the point where this model became so good that they can now generate samples from distribution, like the distribution of faces of people that are indistinguishable from real people, such as the one that you see here on the left. And they have kind of plateaued at that point. They keep getting better and better and better. But for our practical purposes here that I will show you afterwards, this is already pretty much as best as you can hope it to be. All right, so why did I show you these deep generative models? Well, because in practice, when we try to analyze data, such as the data that I showed you from the Rubin Observatory, we actually have to deal with implicit distributions everywhere when we do our analysis. So where are they hiding? Well, the first place where they might be hiding is when we look at the data itself. So, back in the days where we wanted to, wanted to model something like the shape of a galaxy or the image of a galaxy, we would have to assume some very simple, which are too high for us to simply assume that a galaxy looks like this. And actually, when we analyze the data under those kind of assumptions, it actually creates biases that may end up biasing our more important topologies, and have examples of galaxies that are directly given to us by the data. You can think of the data as being its own implicit distribution. Okay, so having access to those generative models will give us a way to build data-driven models here. And then the second very common example that we're dealing with very currently these days is the fact that when you want to write down a physical model for the data that you are trying to acquire, it becomes very difficult to have an analytic physical model that gives us the full distribution of the data that we want to analyze. So another way to say this here on the right, I'm showing you an example of a map of the dark matter distribution that you could see on the sky if you were able to see dark matter, as is given to us by a numerical simulator. So what I see here is a complex field with blobs here are actually clumps of dark matter over the local density on the sky is of dark matter that I cannot describe fully analytically, but I can make simulations of it. And so in this particular instance, you can think of the simulator as being its own implicit distribution. I don't have the actual, analytic description of this distribution, but I can sample from it. And so in both of these cases, the nice thing with deep generative models is that they will give us a way to build an actually tractable model distribution from samples of data. And then we'll be able to plug this model distribution within a larger Bayesian inference framework. And we'll be able to leverage them as conventional models. And I will show you an example of that just after that. All right, so that's the idea of where we're going to use deep generative models. And I want to show you the first example of such an application, which is to try to solve inverse problems. So inverse problems, I don't know if you've already met them in your own research, but they are pretty much everywhere in science or in engineering in general. And they usually take this form where you acquire some data Y here, and you're trying to recover some unknown data X. And that data is being corrupted by this operation here in the middle, plus a little bit of noise here over there. So A, this operator here is usually known, but it's an operator that is losing information about the data that you're trying to recover. And so because you have lost information and you have noise, there is usually not a single possible answer to the problem that you want to consider. And it's very difficult to recover the true X from some observable Y. So here are a few visual illustrations of examples of inverse problems that you can find very easily in astronomy. The first one might be deconvolution, where let's say you have a blurry instrument and you lose some of the small scale details in your image, or you might be missing some part of the data. It's a task called inpainting, or just you might be having a lot of noise on your signal. So in this case, you have no A here, it's just noise, and you are interested in recovering the underlying signal, the underlying image of this planet here. And so the particular example of inverse problem that I want to show you today is one that has to do with the research that I conduct, which is linked to this effect called gravitational lensing. So in gravitational lensing, what happens is that we're looking at galaxies that are very, very far away from us, so far away that in between us who are here and the galaxies that we observe, there might be some very heavy structures, large-scale structures like galaxy clusters in the middle. And so when you have a very heavy structure in the middle, what it does is that it actually deviates the light from these background objects to the point that it can change the shape of the galaxy that we see in the background. It acts as a gravitational lens. And so another way to say this, here is another picture of the same effect where I have a galaxy that is far away from us. Its light travels across the universe, and it ends up being slightly sheared, so stretched in one particular direction due to those gravitational forces in the middle. And then we look at this image through a telescope, and we end up with this thing actually on our sensors, and that's the data that we acquire. So one way to measure this gravitational lensing is actually to look at the ellipticity of this galaxy here. And we can model this ellipticity as some unknown ellipticity of the galaxy before lensing, plus a contribution that comes from this gravitational lensing. So we call it gamma. This is the gravitational shear here. Why do I tell you about this? Well, because one of the tasks that we're trying to do when we do our surveys is to measure this gravitational shear from data. And here you have an illustration of what this shear would look like at the position of a bunch of galaxies on a little patch of the sky. It's very exaggerated, but you can see that there is some pattern here. So we try to go from this thing that we can try to measure on data back to the actual matter distribution that generated these gravitational effects. So what you see here on the right is actually a map of the dark matter, essentially dark matter, in this galaxy cluster that generates this lensing effect. And we call this the convergence kappa typically. And so the nice thing is that you can relate those two things together, and you end up with this form of expression here that you recognize as an instance of an inverse problem. We're trying to reconstruct this kappa here from measurements of gamma. And so that would be fairly easy to do if it were not an ill-posed inverse problem, which in practice it is. So I want to show you on this particular example what I mean by an ill-posed inverse problem. So what you see here are maps of the dark matter distribution on a huge patch of the sky as observed by the Dark Energy Survey in a paper that was released last year. And so all of those 4 plots here are actually looking at the same patch of the sky, the same input data, but they're trying to reconstruct these maps of the matter distribution using several algorithms. And what you see, if you look closely, is that all those 4 algorithms that are considered here gives you slightly different answer. So another way to say this is that they're getting different answers because they are making different assumptions about the data. And the point that I want to highlight here is that they do not give you any sort of uncertainty. They give you an answer. We know it's not the correct one because they all give you different answers, right? And they don't give us how uncertain their answer is. So that's the kind of thing that we want to improve by having a smarter approach that uses deep learning. Okay, so how can we try to do this? Well, we'll take a step back and try to think about this problem in a Bayesian term. So in a Bayesian term, I'm looking at this equation here, and I'm not actually interested in solving for one particular x here. I'm actually interested in trying to quantify this full distribution of all possible solution x for a given set of observation y's. If you remember your Bayes formula, you can actually decompose this full distribution here in 2 terms. The first one being the data likelihood, which gives you how likely is your observed data for a given solution X. And the point that I want to emphasize here is that typically your data likelihood is something that is known and given to you by your physics. That's where you can hard code all of your knowledge about the particular problem that you're trying to solve. And there is usually the second term here, which is the prior, and that prior is going to help you, skim through all of the possible solutions and try to go towards the most likely solutions given your a priori knowledge about the problem. Okay, so if I know how to write down these 2 terms, then I can solve this problem in a Bayesian perspective in a number of ways. So for instance, one approach is to look for the maximum posteriori solution of this problem. That is to say, trying to find the solution X that will maximize this log posterior. So that would be the most likely solution that at the same time is likely for given the data, but also likely under my prior. Okay, and so that gives me a point solution. It's the best solution in some sense. It's the most likely solution to my problem. But I might also be interested in trying to sample the full posterior distribution. So the distribution of all possible solutions given my particular observations. And for this, we know how to do this. There are a bunch of algorithms that allow you to sample for this kind of posteriors as long as you can write down these distributions. Okay. And so now maybe you already see me coming. My question is going to be, how do I choose my prior? I said that the likelihood is totally given by the physics, the prior not so much. So back in the days, the only way that you could solve this kind of Bayesian problem in a tractable way is to assume very simple signal priors. And so here I'm showing you a few examples of those signal priors. I'm going to focus here on this central one, the Gaussian prior, where what you're assuming is that you know that, or you want to assume that the solution is Gaussian, and that you know the power spectrum for that solution. So that is what a Gaussian field would look like. And essentially, the reasons why you make this kind of simplistic assumption is because if you make this assumption, then the prior becomes something that you can exactly evaluate as a practical formula. That gives you a practical way of evaluating the probability of a particular solution under your prior. But the thing that I will say is that if you look at what a Gaussian field looks like, you'll realize that it actually is not very much like the field that we're trying to model. And I'm back at this simulation of the matter distribution that I told you about. This is exactly the same type of signals that I'm trying to reconstruct in this mass mapping problem. Okay, so now the question becomes, what do I do when I have these signals that are not Gaussian, but the nice thing is that I have access to simulations of this signal. And so I'm exactly in the case where I don't know how to write down analytically this prior, but I can think of it as an implicit prior because I have access to simulations from this model, which gives you an implicit distribution. Okay, so you can already guess that I'm going to try to use deep generative models to fit that inside my Bayesian model. But before going into our full problems that I told you about with mass mapping, I want to take a step back and go to a much simpler problem where we are just trying to do denoising. And I'll show you in 2D how we can put together this Bayesian inference idea and those deep generative models. So let's assume that I have access to samples from my prior distribution. So in our case here, there would be examples of signal X with no noise. And here I'm plotting them on the left in 2D, and you can see that they don't live everywhere in the space. They live in very particular regions of this space. And you can think of them, these regions are being essentially the data manifold. So the places in the space where the data actually lives, or reasonable data should live. So because I only have access to these points, those points are not directly tractable or usable for Bayesian inference. But the thing that I can do is to fit a deep generative model to the points that I've observed. So I'm, writing it out like this here. And then now I have a practical distribution that I can evaluate at any point in this 2D space that represents this underlying distribution of the data, okay? So what you see here is this probability of a given point in this 2D space as learned by this deep generative model. So if you think about what I'm trying to do with denoising, you can already guess what the algorithm will look like. Let's say that I observed a noisy data point, it will not be directly in this data manifold because it has noise on it. So it will be somewhere offset from this manifold. And the thing that I want to do is to use my knowledge about where the data should live to try to bring back a point that is offset from the manifold back to the manifold. And so that's exactly what you can do with an algorithm that, like the maxima posteriori algorithm that I told you about, which is going to try to find the most likely solution to my problem by trying to move the solution back to the manifold by maximizing those two terms, or the combination of those two terms. This one, which wants the solutions to be close to the data that is observed, and this one, which wants the solutions to be likely under the prior that I've learned with my generative model. Let me show you in practice what this would look like. Let's say that the purple circle, this purple circle here would be my data point. And this blue circle here, or this blue point here, is the solution of this optimization problem here. So you can see that if I move my data point around, this optimization problem, as it being solved, wants to push the solution to a point that remains in this data manifold here, but that is also very close to the observed data point there. And that is essentially the main idea of what I want to tell you about today, is that by just this example, we've merged the idea of learning with a deep generative model what the data should look like, and using that knowledge to solve an inverse problem. Okay, so that's the general idea of what we want to do. But here it's only done in terms of just one point estimate. But because we have access to all of this Bayesian inference machinery, we can also try to access the full posterior solution. And that's exactly what we did for this problem of trying to reconstruct maps of the matter distribution on the sky. I'm going to go back to the equations here, where here you recognize the posterior distribution. So all of the possible maps that are compatible with the measured ellipticities of galaxies that we see on the sky. And I can split it in two terms, the first one being the likelihood term. So I won't go into the details of what these terms are, but the thing I should tell you is that this is known by the physics. This is given to us by gravitational physics. And then here I have this prior that I need to specify. And so the prior is not something that I can write down analytically, but I have access to my simulation. So I run a bunch of simulations. And from these simulations, the idea will be to learn a deep generative model that I can then use in my Bayesian inference. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit more about how we do this in practice. So it's going to get a little bit technical here. So feel free to ask me questions afterwards if you don't get everything here. So I'm going to tell you about the actual way that we can do this at scale for a problem like this. So far, I haven't shown any neural networks. You will have noticed, and here I'll tell you about how this works in practice. Okay, so the first thing that I want you to see is that when I want to know where my data distribution is, what I actually need in most practical algorithm is not the value of the probability at any point in the space. It's actually the thing that is called the score function. So the gradient of this probability, or you can think of it as also this arrow field here that points towards where I should move my solution so that it becomes likely under my particle prior. And so if you are familiar with Bayesian inference, maybe you already know that this score function that you see here comes up in algorithms like gradient descent that we use for finding the maximum a posteriori. It also comes up in Markov-Chain Monte Carlo algorithm, like the Langevin algorithm. It comes up here, or in the Hamiltonian Monte Carlo algorithm. So the score function is actually something that is very powerful and interesting to learn. And so the practical way that we do generative modeling in this problem that I told you about for mass mapping is not to try to learn this P of X, but try to learn this gradient of this P of X, this score function. And this is something that you can actually very easily do by training a denoiser on example of your data. And so here is the idea. So let's say that I have access to samples from my implicit distribution X. The thing that I can do is to add Gaussian noise to this image, to this data, to get those X prime here. So X is an example of real data. I add some Gaussian noise and I get my X prime. Given this X prime, I can train a neural network that I call R theta here to try to denoise those points. So I give the network as an input the noisy image, and I try to train it to recover the true image under an L2 loss. So it looks like this. And so if you do this, you can actually show that the optimal network that is trained under this regression loss will learn a function that is directly linked to the score function. So the direction in which you need to update a point so that it becomes more likely under your data distribution. And so the magical thing that happens is that just by doing this denoising task, you learn something that gives you an information about the score. So in practice here, what it would look like, this is an example of an image. I add noise to it, and then I train my network to denoise that image. And this thing that I see here, where I take the noisy image minus the output of my network, it will be proportional to the score that I'm trying to learn. So the magical thing about this is that this is extremely easy to train a network to do this. And it's also the method that reaches the state of the art in nowadays applications. So last thing that I want to mention about this kind of methods is that once I have the score, it's still not the full answer to the problem, because it's usually very difficult to sample from distributions that can be very multimodals from the distribution themselves, even if you have access to the score information. And so to be able to sample in high number of dimensions over very complex distributions, we also use this annealing algorithm, where essentially the idea is, if I want to sample from this distribution here on the right, which can be very difficult, it has two modes that are very separated from each other. The idea is that I can convolve this distribution with some amount of noise, again. And as I add more and more noise to the distribution, it becomes just a blob, essentially. And so sampling from that distribution here on the left becomes very easy, because it's just one big blob, and that's very easy to sample from. And then if I evolve a chain and slowly lower the temperature, the chain will end up in one of the modes here, and that back to no noise will have reached one point in the target distribution. That idea of annealing your distribution is extremely powerful. And in practice, that's what allows us to sample very efficiently very complex images. So I'm going to show you the results very quickly, and then I'll move on to some conclusions. Here is an example of real images, real signal from a simulation. And in this particular sample, I'm assuming that my survey, so my data, will only give me information about the center of this white region. And I don't see anything outside of this region. Okay. So here is what the traditional reconstruction algorithm would do in this particular instance. You see that outside of the survey region, there is no information, so it goes to 0. But inside of the survey region, I don't get all of the small details that I had in my input data. And this is because here, there is no actual way to put strong priors about your solution. So a better algorithm is this Wiener filter algorithm, which tries to solve this inverse problem by using, for instance, a Gaussian prior on your solution. This is the simple prior that I told you about. And again, although this is more evolved, you see that it cannot recover the small details of the maps, because the maps are not Gaussian themselves. And that's the solution that we get with our approach, where we train a deep generative model to learn full prior over simulated maps. And then we sample from the full posterior distribution. And here, what I'm showing you is just taking the mean of those samples. And you can see that the mean retained a lot of detail about the true signal on the map, much better than those simple analytic priors were able to do. And because I also have access to posterior samples, I don't just get an image of, only one reconstruction of this field. I get a full distribution of all possible reconstructions of this field. That's extremely powerful. And this is what you see here on the right. So you see that this is moving a lot because each image on the right is one possible reconstruction. And there are regions in this image where all solutions kind of always look the same. So for instance, this big blob here, and that is an indication that the data is very constraining in this particular region of the space and really wants to put a big clump of matter there. So no matter the reconstruction, there is no choice. The data wants to put something there. This is why you see it all the time in our reconstructions. And then if you see outside of the survey, you'll see that every time each reconstruction is very different from each other because it's no longer likelihood driven. It's no longer driven by your data. It's completely prior driven. So it always looks like a map of dark matter, but it's never the same one. Okay, so that gives you a full way to fully quantify the uncertainty on your solution because you can access the full posterior distribution here. And so here I showed you on this example, a way to do this, but we did it in a whole lot of other examples. For instance, for this deep learning problem that I told you about at the beginning, where here you have the log posterior that we use in this problem, the prior over the shape of galaxies it learned from examples of galaxies themselves. And on the left here, you have the likelihood term that is completely physically driven. So here, this is information about the noise that we know of the instrument. This is information about the point spread function of the instrument, something that we also know of. And one particular point that I want to make here is that these kind of artifacts that showed up, that I showed you in this black box deep learning approach, cannot show up here because we explicitly constrain the solution to be compatible to the data within the likelihood. So you cannot add to the solution a blob that is not present in the data. And just to show you that this has application way outside of astrophysics, the last example I want to show you here on the right is an application in medical imaging, where we reconstruct the full posterior solution over MRI reconstructions. And again, here you can see a movie of those MRI reconstructions. And in a region of this movie where it fluctuates a lot, it means that the data is not very constraining, that you're more prior driven. And another way to say it is that the physician should not pay too much attention about those details because it gives them a visual information that this particular region of the image is not well constrained by the data, which is something that was typically lacking in classical neural network-based reconstruction of medical imaging. All right, so the main takeaways that I want to highlight here is that having access to the deep generative models here have given us a way to take those implicit distributions that can either be driven by data themselves or by simulations and put them inside a physical model where we have a likelihood that is given by physics and that we can solve with a Bayesian approach that gives us robust uncertainty quantification. So in particular, the explicit likelihood is nice because if you are able to solve the problem, you can change the likelihood for a slightly different problem. So for instance, let's say your observations are done with slightly different noise. That is just a matter of changing slightly the likelihood. And then you don't need to retrain anything. You can rerun your inference method on this. And again, this is just a way to highlight the power of generative models as data and simulation-driven priors. So I'm going to stop here because I'm out of time. But if you want to ask me questions also about two other themes that I have slides for, about simulation-based inference or automatically differentiable physics, feel free to ask me afterwards. And I'm going to stop on my last slide. Thank you very much for your attention.
Cool. Thanks very much. So yeah, does everyone in the room have a question? So first of all, thank you for going into details. It's nice. In my field, in the last, I would say, 18 months, I've seen a lot of what they themselves call physics-informed models pop up in many places, and the presentations I've seen, or even the papers themselves, have been quite surface level about the details and the internals of how they really managed to get those things working. So it's nice to get to see a little bit inside how this works. I'm interested in, very early on in the presentation, you mentioned that one of the big issues training models is that sometimes you're going to be faced with the fact that you have data that's out of your training distribution, let's say. So I was wondering, when you move to a physics-informed model, I guess it's difficult to quantify, but does that help you circumvent this weakness of having data points outside of the training distribution? Or is it more something you're going to feel in the uncertainty of the prediction you make?
Okay, so these are great questions. So the first one is, okay, my point of view on this whole deep learning business is that you always want to be able to relate it to a physical model. So you don't want to have, let's say, a neural network, you show it the sky and it gives you the answer to cosmology, the universe, and everything. You need to have a physical description of like a forward process that should be able to generate the universe as you observe it. And then the only places where I see, deep learning being useful, let's say, is making this process of analyzing data with a forward model scalable at both the complexity and the scale of the data that we have to deal with. So it's a long answer to say that if you want to remain model-based, if you want to remain Bayesian, you are never exactly in this situation where you have training data that is not correct for the data that you want to apply your model on. Another way to say this is that your training data is always given by your prior assumptions about the physics of the problem that you're trying to solve. I don't know if it's very clear, but like in this particular instance, where I wanted to reconstruct maps of the dark matter distribution on the sky, the training data is actually a physical simulator that implements my physical understanding of what the dark matter distribution on the sky should be. And so if then the training data is not compatible with the real universe, it's not really a problem of the machine learning, it's more physics problem that my simulator, my physical simulator, is not the right model for analyzing the data. And more generally, then it's just a general question about Bayesian inference, where you are using a model to analyze data, but if your model is not correct, if it's very distinct or it's not compatible with the data, you end up in a situation called model misspecification, where you might have biased answers, biased results, just because the model that you use to analyze the data is not the correct one. And that is a broader question than just a deep learning question. It's just a question of doing Bayesian inference with particular models. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Mostly. Am I right to understand that because your network is physics informed, if you get data that's out of the training distribution, it's not a problem with the data, it's mostly a problem of the physics model itself, right?
Exactly, that's exactly right. And so in general, yeah.
I have a quick follow-up question. If, let's say that's the case, and you've got, I don't know, a whole bunch of samples from your observable data that would tell you there's a problem in your physics model, how would that manifest in the predictions? How would you be informed yourself as the human and the user of this model that you have to rethink your physics?
Right. So that's a great question. And that's actually one of the biggest challenges that we'll face with trying to use deep learning for analyzing data. So I have a section on this, which would be for another day, I guess, which is essentially trying to analyze, let's say, the full sky by feeding it to a neural network and asking the neural network to output some summary statistics that are informative about the cosmology. And so in this approach, you take a network, you apply it to your data, and you take the output of the network as your, statistics that you want to do inference with. But this network in the middle is a big black box. And so there is no real way of knowing how it might, react in cases where the data is actually different from the simulations that you would use to train it on. So you can imagine that actually the differences would show up as huge deviation of the statistics compared to what you would expect, but absolutely not guaranteed. And in general, you cannot, reliably apply a network outside of the training regime in which it has been trained on. So whether or not we'll be able to trust what comes out of this type of neural networks when we apply them to huge cosmological surveys is really, really an ongoing question. And the short answer is that so far there is no way of testing, robustly whether or not the data that you apply it on is an outlier.
Okay, thank you very much. That's all my questions.
Yeah, I've got to say, perhaps you should introduce yourself as well.
Sorry, yeah. You mean to everyone, generally speaking?
Well, I suppose if I say you will.
So yeah, I'm not on camera because it's being picky, but hi, I'm Felix. I'm a LiveDat PhD with the University of Liverpool, and mostly all my work has been done at CERN. I'm in, oh God, that hurts, my 4th year, and I'm currently writing, so hopefully you won't see me in about 6 months, which would be good for me. Cheers.
Thank you. Anybody else in the room have a question? Okay, if not, I suppose I've got a quick one. So in the best case scenario, what does the methodology that you were mainly presenting mean for things like cosmological parameter inference in the case of improved convergence maps over kind of more traditional methods?
So in general, I wouldn't recommend using those convergence maps for cosmological inference. I think they could be useful for actually mapping the matter distribution and doing some cluster science or something like this. But for cosmological inference, there are 2 ways forward. The first, the map of the sky to a neural network, it gives you a few numbers, and then from these few numbers and simulations, you can learn the likelihood that corresponds to the statistics, and you can do inference that way. That's a practical way to do this. And the way that I prefer actually is by doing hierarchical Bayesian inference, where you build a simulator for your data, but that simulator is itself just a big Bayesian model that is written in a framework like TensorFlow or JAX, that you can take gradients through your Bayesian model, and you can take derivatives of the likelihood with respect to all of the parameters that are involved in the simulation. That allows you to do full inference over not only the cosmological parameters, but let's say the matter distribution that is being traced by this lensing effect on the entire light cone. So that's the most exciting thing that I'm trying to push. And we have developed n-body simulations, for instance, that are written entirely in TensorFlow or JAX, so that we can get gradients through those complex simulations here.
Okay, thank you.
So what I wanted to ask was, I mean, you've already shown that these Bayesian models, you have to, because you're putting in such basically fairly severe priors, what regularization techniques can you use to determine if there's enough information, where the noise floor in your matrix inversion comes? Because ultimately, all you're really doing is inverting an A matrix to the inverse. It's a mathematically complex way of doing it, but ultimately, where is the statistical flaw? Where's the uncertainty? Because as you showed with your 2 half circles, ultimately your technique will always put you on your sort of one of your input parameters, or it will put you on the best fit your input model, which means, so you do need a way of evaluating that. So are there tests that would tell you where the statistical flaw is for this?
So you mean in terms of extracting information?
Well, it's sort of things like, if you're looking across here, there is clearly some noise on the image on the left, and there is less noise on the posterior image, but sort of your posterior samples are varying. At some point,
right,
there is a significance associated with the this unfolding technique. And
right. Yeah.
Is there an objective way of saying, sort of that bright point that you pointed out is clearly there, but the satellite point above and to the right of it might be there?
Right. So yeah, that's an excellent question. And so, you know, for cosmology, you know, it doesn't matter as much as for, let's say, medical imaging, where you might be asking whether there is a tumor in some part of the brain. And so the short answer is that so far there are no perfect ways to do this. But our hope here is that because you have access to full posterior samples, you can, for instance, look at if you can identify a particular feature on one of these images, you can look at the frequency at which this feature appears. If it's above a particular threshold, you can say that it seems to be very strongly indicated by data. If it's below a particular threshold, you can say that it doesn't seem to be strongly wanted by the data, is a way to say this. It's not easy to come up with a full, you know, a simple statement about significativity here, because you need to come up with a measurement on these things before you can talk about the significance of that measurement. Because here they are just maps in high dimensions. And so in practice, in the paper, we had a lot of hard time coming up with ways of quantifying the uncertainty. And so far, there are only two ways. Either you look at all of the posterior samples like this movie, or you make maps of the standard deviation, for instance, and then you can look at whether or not this region is like bright in the posterior mean, but also has lots of standard deviation, in which case maybe you should believe it too much. It's not strongly motivated data.
The concrete example I can immediately think of is what happens if there are satellite galaxies. So you've got a model of your galaxy distortion. Clearly, a satellite galaxy would fake sort of bigger distortion or smaller distortion, depending on the way it goes. And if you don't have any satellite galaxies in your the model you built for your Bayesian inference, that'll be missing.
Oh, right.
So it's so could you increase the dimensionality of your original smooth model to try and take into account more physical properties and see what the effects would be?
Oh, I see. So yeah. So you're saying, what if my simulator is not realistic or does not encapsulate the particular case that happened in practice? So two things. So that another way of saying that your prior is not perfect and is actually not does not contain the truth, which is not great. But one way to think about it is that in this kind of posterior maps here, although the prior has a strong influence, you cannot retain a blob or a structure that is not actually wanted by the data to some extent. So two answers. One, I don't have a good answer to you about how to quantify whether or not the prior or how to extend this prior if it's not correct. But second, even though the prior may not be correct, the fact that a particular structure remains in the posterior samples means that it's not just driven by the prior, it's also driven by the likelihood. So there is, some likelihood constraints there.
Okay, I mean, I'm a high energy physicist, and one of the things we do is we do a lot of if your likelihood is correct, or if your underlying function is correct, how likely is this data to come from that, and then sort of use that as a metric to determine if your underlying
I see.
or otherwise is reasonable. I
right.
don't know if this method would allow for that.
I think I don't know how many dimensions are you working with typically?
Well, it's basically as many parameters as you want. You have fitting 27 different parameters. So I don't think we quite think about it in dimensionalities in quite that term. So I couldn't give you an answer. So basically, if I've got this much data sampled from this distribution, throw 1,000 of them. How likely, are they all more likely than my real distribution, in which case my priors are wrong?
Right. Yeah. So I see your point. So yeah, I agree with that. The only thing that I would be worried about is that in a very high number of dimensions, there is a lot of wiggle room, so that you can change the way the signal looks like without actually changing too much the likelihood, because the likelihood is very under constrained. Or not very constraining is another way to say this. So you can get maps that are completely unrealistic, but they are still very likely under the likelihood.
Okay.
So
All right. Thank you very
partial
much.
answer.